everyone. Welcome to part 2 of chapter 10 on Latin America. Next in the region, we're going to talk about population patterns. It is mostly urban, unlike the last two regions that we were talking about, South and East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Mostly concentrated along the coastlines, especially in Brazil. Very large populations in Brazil along the coastline. Also concentrated in the highlands and the Andes in Mexico and Central America. We're going to look at some of the elevations of some major cities in the region that again allow for that milder climate. Even though you're in an equatorial and tropical region, you're getting at a much milder climate being at that high elevation. Urbanization levels are particularly high in some countries, over 50% in Mexico and over 50% in Brazil. And again, when we talk about those higher elevations, Mexico City at 7,500 feet, La Paz at over 12,000 feet, Quito in Ecuador at 9,600 feet. These places were chosen because of those milder climates at those higher elevations. So even though, again, you're in this very equatorial and tropical region, you're going to get these nicer climates in these cities. Just wanted to show, again, this graph that I keep showing for a lot of regions, but a lot of differences in the Human Development Index in the region. Some countries are pretty high, like Argentina, 0.797. And remember, 1 is perfect score on the Human Development Index, but no country gets a 1, as opposed to a country like Haiti with 0.4. Dramatically different for a variety of reasons, but a lot of it has to do with the type of government that was set up after colonialism and whether or not they were an extractive regime. Next, we're going to look at cities and what Latin American cities look like. To the right here, you see a picture of Buenos Aires, which is quite Parisian and European looking. Most of the major cities resemble European, especially Spanish cities. The old cities of the older civilizations were taken down, and during colonization, new European-style cities were built. So again, near the city center, you have that central plaza and the most desirable neighborhoods, and some less so desirable, but generally speaking, that same pattern where the most desirable things are at the city center. Lower class neighborhoods on the periphery, especially at high elevations. I'll show you some pictures of some lower class neighborhoods on the next few slides, and they're really built on these very, very steep slopes on the peripheries of these cities. So you have things like shanty towns and favelas in Brazil, colonias in Mexico, lots of these kind of informal settlements that pop up on the periphery of these cities. And so you can see here, if you look at this picture of Rio in the bottom right, built on these very steep hillsides, this less desirable. Here's Bogota in Colombia, same thing. Here's Peru, and then in Sao Paulo as well. When we talk about race and ethnicity in the region, again, we're looking at a lot of people of mixed descent, but a few different ethnic groups going on. So pre-Columbus or pre-colonization, pre-European contact, there were really large indigenous populations in the region. And European colonizers came in, and they came in small numbers, and they were mostly men. Many indigenous were killed by war and disease, and again, most of the people that were killed by war were men. So now you have a large indigenous population that is getting to be predominantly female. European colonizers come in who were in small numbers and mostly men. So do the math. Many people today are of mixed ancestry in the region. We also have Africans who were brought to the region, especially to Haiti and Brazil, to work on sugar plantations, lots of warm, rainy places. And despite a lot of people being of this mixed race background, race, appearance, and labels still hold a lot of weight in the region. And generally speaking, lighter skin provides privilege. So, still in a majority of countries, it is lighter skinned people of mostly European descent that are in places of power and in government, although that is changing a little bit. Um, and there's also recent immigration to the region, especially some parts of the region have pretty large immigration coming from South and East Asia, and that is also increasing diversity in the region. And so, a couple of pictures here. Here is one of Brazil's soccer team from a few years ago. Most countries in the world care about soccer, except for the United States, who didn't even make the World Cup this year, but that's another story. Right, lots of diversity. This is a friend of my husband's, Ricardo. Ricardo is from Brazil, and he was nice enough to share with us. He did that 23andMe Discover Your Ancestry. Ricardo is mostly European, but also sub-Saharan African, some East Asian and Native American, and a little bit of Middle Eastern, North African. So he is pretty representative of the type of diversity in the region. And again, if we look at the leaders of the region, right, many of them look, quite European, quite white, not of an indigenous or African background. Fujimori of Peru, who is no longer the leader, but then his daughter was for a while. He was quite controversial. He was of Japanese descent. There are some, again, pretty large Asian populations in certain parts of the region. And if you look at Brazil's president and cabinet, entirely made up of white men. However, there is a large influence of indigenous cultures and indigenous peoples still present in the region. And so, again, pre-colonial, there was big advanced civilizations. We think about places like Machu Picchu, large cities, the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, and these empires were vanquished, but the people remained, right? So Europeans came, many people died, many people died from disease and from warfare, but not everybody. So those people are still there. For example, there are 6 million people of Mayan descent alive today. And they are generally in places with previous high concentrations of these individuals. And also in isolated places. There's always this kind of false narrative that goes around that they're like undiscovered tribes in the Amazon. That is not true. There are plenty of people who choose to live in isolation, but they are certainly aware of the outside world. So again, when we look at indigenous people in Latin America, at present there are 826 indigenous peoples. That means different groups of people. An estimated 200 are an additional 200 are estimated to be living in voluntary isolation, right? So people who are choosing a more traditional lifestyle and to live in isolation, but are certainly aware of the outside world. And so we, again, vast civilizations before major cities, Machu Picchu probably being one of the most famous ones, right? There were many indigenous people living in the region before colonization and European contact. So indigenous culture in the region, those people are generally living in more rural areas, in mountains, but not always. And in some places in quite high concentrations, 55% in Bolivia, 45% in Peru. Many Amazonian tribes were isolated until the 20th century, but again, now it is of a voluntary isolation. All of these people experience some sort of marginalization in society. They're generally the poorest members of society, and they are living on the periphery. Many of them making living, interacting with tourists in some way. But there are movements for cultural autonomy, land stewardship. Many people have been living on these lands as communal lands for thousands of years, but they lack um, kind of concrete land tenure, so they don't have a deed that says that they own the land. And post-colonization, there was kind of a lot of land grabbing in the area where the most desirable land were kind of snatched up, especially by agricultural corporations. So lots of indigenous people trying to get their land back and get some type of secure legal um, uh, recognition of it. Also, recognition and protection of languages. There's a great diversity of indigenous languages in the region. Some are only spoke by a very small number of people, and a lot of them are continually going extinct as no one speaks them. So again, lots of indigenous movements in the region. One language in the region was at risk of dying out because the last two speakers of the language aren't talking to each other. This is from a few years ago. But lots of efforts in the region to go and document these languages before they go entirely extinct. And so when we talk a little bit more about language in the region, most of the language that's spoken in the region are the languages of the European colonizers. Those are the lingua franca, and they are most common. Spanish, Portuguese, and a couple others, including Dutch, English, and French, but Spanish being, you know, really all over the place. Portuguese, mostly throughout Brazil. There are still many indigenous languages that are quite common, um, especially in parts of southern Mexico, and again towards the centers of many of South America. And there's a lot of push for to recognize indigenous languages. This is a $5,000 note, which is actually not very much money, from the Republic of Paraguay. And they named it the Guarani, which is actually the name of the predominant indigenous language in the region. Religion in the region is mostly Catholic, which when we talked about Europe, we talked about how even though a lot of people identify as Catholic or some type of Protestant, that they're mostly living this kind of secular lifestyle. Catholicism still has a big influence in the region. Right, missionaries helped colonize the region, and they took a convert to Catholicism or be killed. So many people were converted. This is really evidence in place names and structures. Um, but lots of conservative culture and politics. Chile only legalized divorce in 2004. Right? In the Catholic Church, you're not allowed to get divorced unless you are granted an annulment by the church. Legal abortion is really rare in the region, which this is kind of unusual. Usually, very often, countries with a high human development index are more likely to have legal abortion. We also see Protestantism in former English and Dutch colonies, and then syncretic or these kind of combined religions, some kind of animism, Catholicism mix in parts of the Caribbean. But again, if we look at abortion legality by country, right, most of this region, there is either no abortion allowed or there are some restrictions. You can only have an abortion to save a woman's life or to preserve their health, which again is two different things. One is a life or death situation, and one is just that it may be harmful to the mother's health. So in Brazil recently, when the Zika virus was really prevalent, which pregnant women, if they contract Zika, in a certain stage in their pregnancy, and they're not exactly sure when that is, you wind up with this birth defect called microencephalopathy, and it basically you have a baby that's born with an extraordinarily small brain, and so there were lots of women who knew that they had babies who were not going to survive very long, after giving birth, but they had to carry these babies to full term because of the restrictions on abortion in Brazil. And so when we look at colonization and independence, and this is kind of a not a great map, and so excuse me for it, but the current borders are somewhat reflective of colonization. And I'd like to remind everybody in this class that, up until a certain point, all of California was part of Mexico. I think sometimes we forget that. So the Spanish had divided a lot of the region into these viceroyalties. And so some of those, and then they also had colonies of other European countries, and so those served somewhat as the current borders, although some also broke off after that. The mainland gained independence in the early 1800s, much, much earlier than sub-Saharan Africa, which gained most of those countries gained independence in the mid-1900s. There was some splintering and consolidation and territorial wars. You end up with lots of small island countries who have more recent independence. There's still several colonies. There's the British Virgin Islands and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Plenty of islands there that are still under control of other countries. I believe this is the last slide for this section, but some recent kind of geopolitical issues in the region. The borders are mostly settled. So having gained independence now 200 years ago, for most places, or nearly 200 years ago, those borders are pretty well defined. But there are many extractive regimes still present, but there were a lot up until very recently. So you had these countries their governments were highly repressive, such as Manuel Noriega in Panama. Argentina went through a period of time where nearly 30,000 people went missing. They disappeared, which there's still kind of this great call to figure out what happened to these people. Although it's presumed that they were killed by the government. There was a huge U.S. influence in the region, including something called the Monroe Doctrine. So after independence, James Monroe, our president at the time, and again, this is in the 1800s, basically said that they would work to prevent any European country kind of seizing control of any country in the region again. And this was also later used as a justification to stop communism in the region. As you can see, there's a picture of us in Grenada. Grenada with communism stops here. When the U.S. kind of made this Monroe Doctrine in the beginning, nobody really took it that seriously because at the time in the 1800s we had a pretty weak army and a pretty weak navy. But generally speaking, we have had a huge influence in the region. After you watch this part, you're going to watch a short kind of cartoony video that talks about Che Guevara in the region and his battles for independence, particularly in Cuba. He is from Argentina. He's quite a controversial figure too. Some see him as a revolutionary and a hero, and some see him as basically a warlord who helped spread communism throughout the region. So you're going to watch that next. And so we've had several military interventions in this region under the guise of preventing the spread of communism or trying to keep European control or trying to prevent revolutions from happening that would affect U.S. interests. We have frequently supported dictators in order to accomplish these goals in the past. So, and that video that you're going to watch after this will talk about that a little bit. So that is the end of part 2. You're going to watch a little video about Che Guevara and then move on to part 3.